You can study in the morning, you can study at night. You can study outside by a campfire light. You can study with the rabbi.
The Torah can be a pretty violent book. In fact, if you look just at the death penalty in the Bible, it seems to be all over the place. The Bible calls all the time for people to be put to death, for breaking Shabbat, for being a rebellious child, for lots of different reasons. People are supposed to be put to death. But in this week's Parsha, we get a little bit of a different perspective on the death penalty. In this week's Parsha, the Torah tells us that the hands of the witnesses should be the first to put the person to death, and then the nation should participate. The reason they talk about the nation participating is because usually the death penalty in the Bible was done by stoning. But what's important here is that the hands of the witnesses, the very people who are saying that this person did what they did this crime and should be put to death, those very people have to cast the first stone. That's a weighty proposition for witnesses to understand that it's their testimony that might cause a person to be put to death, and then for them to have to actually carry that out. That's a weighty proposition. And this week's Parsha is only the beginning of the hesitation around the biblical idea of the death penalty. When the rabbis pick it up in the Talmud, they go even farther. There's a famous Mishnah that teaches us that anyone, if a Sanhedrin, if a high court kills one person in 7 years, it's a terrible court. It's a faulty court. And then it goes farther and says one person in 70 years. And then if the Sanhedrin ever puts someone to death, it's a terrible thing. So Judaism has evolved on this idea of the death penalty, even though the Bible itself seems to embrace it. And I think that we would be smart to learn from this week's Parsha. We'd be smart to learn from the way Judaism evolved in the death penalty. Just look at the past 2 years. In 2014, 35 people were put to death in the United States. In 2015, already this year, 19 people have been put to death. And when we think about the botched executions, let's assume for the moment that you agree with the death penalty, if we just look at how they've been carried out in 2014 in Ohio, Dennis McGuire; in April of 2014, Oklahoma, Clayton Lockett; in July of 2014, Joseph Wood; all these terribly botched executions where the people were suffering for minutes, some of them for hours. If you agree with the death penalty, then you at least have to acknowledge that we have not embraced this idea that the rabbis bring forth, and it starts in this week's Parsha, that we should be very hesitant to use it. And if you don't agree with the death penalty, which is where I fall, then you really have to struggle with what has happened to our nation that puts more people to death than most other first world countries, that has more people in jail and calls upon the death penalty in cases that otherwise in other civilizations and other countries would never warrant such a punishment. This week's Parsha tells us that the death penalty may be okay, but using it has to be done with great care. And that's, I think, where we've dropped the ball. Maybe we can begin to learn. And maybe someday we can even follow the teaching of our rabbis that say that a Sanhedrin, a court that ever uses the death penalty, is a terrible court.
Let's talk some Torah. It's okay, as you will see, that we're bound to disagree. Don't have to see eye to eye to make the Torah come alive. Now that I've had my say, let's not waste the whole day.